There is a moment, months before diagnosis, when the body already knows something is wrong. It doesn't collapse you to the floor. It doesn't scream for attention. It sends a signal so quiet, so easy to explain away that almost everyone misses it, including, more often than you'd think, the clinicians looking straight at it. Not from carelessness, because the odds are stacked against noticing. 6 of those signals are pulled from the medical records of thousands of real patients. Not folklore, not fear. Patterns researchers only found by looking backward, after it was already too late to use them. If even one of them sounds familiar, keep watching, because familiar is exactly the problem. Here's where the story usually starts, and it starts so quietly, you'd almost certainly wave it away. Before you assume this is another fear-based health video, it isn't. Every symptom on this list is common. All 6 on their own are usually nothing. That's not a disclaimer. That's the entire mystery. If these signs were rare or strange or obviously dangerous, they'd never get missed. A doctor would catch them instantly. But they're not rare. They're some of the most ordinary complaints in medicine. A tired body, a sore back, a stomach that feels off, which is exactly why pancreatic cancer has one of the worst early detection records of any major cancer. Not because it hides, because it looks like everything else. But that's not the whole story. Here's the shape of what's coming. 6 signals, ranked from the ones so ordinary you've probably felt at least one this year, to the ones so unexpected that even the research behind it treats it as a lead, not a conclusion. Along the way, 3 questions get answered. Why a tumor can grow for the better part of a year without producing a single symptom anyone would call alarming. What order these 6 signals actually tend to appear in, because that order is almost the reverse of what you'd guess. And once you see it, you'll never think about just being tired the same way again. And which one of these 6 has nothing to do with your stomach, your back, or your weight at all? The strangest signal on the entire list. We start with the one almost everyone already has an excuse for. Sign 1. And it's almost insultingly ordinary. Fatigue that doesn't match your life. Not tired after a long week. A heavier kind. The kind 8 hours of sleep doesn't touch. The kind that makes an ordinary Tuesday feel like it's asking too much of you. On its own, this means almost nothing. Fatigue is the single most common complaint in all of medicine. A symptom of low iron, thyroid trouble, poor sleep, stress, depression, a dozen medications, or nothing at all. Except there's a problem. In one of the largest recent studies on this, over 2,600 confirmed pancreatic cancer cases pulled directly from patient health records, fatigue showed up in roughly 2 out of every 3 patients before they were ever diagnosed. Researchers even calculated when it typically started, a median of about 7 months before diagnosis. 7 months. Long before jaundice. Long before anything that sends someone to a doctor in a panic, which is exactly why this gets missed. Nobody goes to urgent care for being a little more tired than usual. And that's the point. Fatigue alone isn't the story. It's the first sentence of one. Sign 2. And this is where the pattern stops feeling like coincidence. Back pain that doesn't act like normal back pain. Most back pain has a simple explanation. Posture, a strained muscle, a mattress that's seen better years. It responds to movement, to stretching, to time. This doesn't. It's described as a deep, dull ache, sometimes higher than typical lower back pain, that doesn't ease with rest and can be worse lying down at night. In that same large study, back pain showed up in just over half of patients, and it started even earlier than fatigue. A median of 11 months before diagnosis, nearly a year. Here's the strange part. There's an anatomical reason for this. The pancreas sits deep against the back wall of the abdomen, wrapped in a dense web of nerves. When something disturbs that area, pain doesn't necessarily stay where the problem actually is. It can radiate straight through to the back, a documented pattern, not speculation. But before you panic about every ache in your spine, a large UK study of primary care records found that back pain by itself barely moves the needle on someone's actual risk. Alone, it's weak, almost meaningless. It only becomes worth noticing once it stops being alone. Sign 3, and this is where most people stop suspecting anything medical at all. Appetite and digestion quietly turning against you. Not skipping meals because you're busy. Losing interest in food itself. Feeling full after 4 bites. A heavy, bloated sensation after meals that never used to happen. Nausea that shows up for no reason and leaves the same way. If you've explained this away as my stomach's just off lately, you're not alone. This is almost a perfect disguise. It overlaps almost exactly with the most common stomach complaints in medicine. Reflux, gastritis, irritable bowel syndrome, plain indigestion. That overlap isn't an accident, which is why this gets missed so often. Here's the mechanism. A tumor growing in or near the pancreas can interfere with digestion before it does anything else, pressing against the stomach, disrupting the enzymes that break down food, altering the signals that tell your brain you're full. It doesn't need to be large. It only needs to be in the way. In the same study, appetite loss appeared in just over half of confirmed cases. Nausea in nearly 2/3. On their own, these are some of the least least specific symptoms on this entire list, almost useless as evidence. But stack them on top of unexplained fatigue and a back pain that won't behave, and three separate coincidences start looking like something else entirely. So here's the first answer we owe you. Why can a tumor grow for the better part of a year without setting off a single alarm? Start with where it lives. The pancreas isn't like a lump you could ever feel yourself, the way you might on a breast or a testicle. It's buried behind the stomach, pressed against the back wall of the body, boxed in by other organs, threaded with nerves. There's no shallow surface for early pain to gather on, no obvious place for the body to point to and say, here. A tumor can sit there for months, causing nothing worse than a vague ache, because there's no nerve nearby enough to shout that something is wrong. Then there's what the organ actually does. Two jobs. It manufactures the enzymes that digest your food, and it manufactures the hormones, insulin among them, that control your blood sugar. A tumor doesn't need to be large to interfere with either. Disturb the enzymes, and digestion quietly goes haywire. Disturb the insulin-producing cells, and blood sugar drifts in a way that looks, on paper, exactly like ordinary diabetes. And then, the detail that explains almost everything else on this list, the head of the pancreas sits directly against the bile duct, the tube carrying bile from the liver into the gut. Only when a tumor grows large enough to press on that duct does the body finally produce something impossible to miss: jaundice, yellow skin, yellow eyes. The one sign that sends almost everyone straight to a doctor: no hesitation, which means the most obvious, undeniable sign of this disease is also almost always the last one to arrive. This cancer was never silent. It was speaking the entire time, just in a language built out of ordinary life. Tiredness, a sore back, a stomach that feels off. That's not bad luck. That's anatomy. And once you understand that, the next three signs on this list are going to look very different. Sign 4. And here, for the first time, the data stops being forgiving. Weight loss you never asked for. Not a diet, not new workouts, just less of you than there used to be, and no clear reason why. In that same UK study, more than 3,600 confirmed cases compared against over 16,000 matched people without cancer, unexplained weight loss carried something like a 15-fold increase in the odds of an eventual diagnosis. 15 times. That's not in the same category as fatigue or back pain. Of everything on this list, aside from what's still ahead, this is the one researchers take the most seriously. Except, and this matters, it's still not proof of anything. Most unexplained weight loss has nothing to do with pancreatic cancer. Thyroid problems, depression, undiagnosed diabetes, and simple appetite change explain the overwhelming majority of cases. But here's where clinical guidelines actually draw a line. Unexplained weight loss in someone over 60, combined with almost any digestive complaint at all, is treated as reason enough to order imaging. Not because either symptom alone is damning, because together they cross a threshold that neither reaches by itself. One sign finally starting to matter on its own, which means we're getting closer to the one that matters most. Sign 5 is the one almost nobody would think connect to any of this at all. New onset diabetes, especially later in life. Picture someone in their late 50s or 60s. No family history of diabetes, no major weight gain, none of the usual risk factors, and then suddenly their blood sugar climbs, or diabetes they've managed easily for years abruptly stops responding. The obvious assumption is ordinary type 2 diabetes, age finally catching up, and most of the time that assumption is correct. But remember what the pancreas actually does. A tumor growing there can damage or crowd out the very cells that regulate blood sugar, producing a lab result indistinguishable on paper from routine diabetes. The same UK study found new onset diabetes carried roughly double the odds of a later pancreatic cancer diagnosis. Smaller than weight loss, smaller than what's coming, but real enough that clinical guidelines list it alongside other symptoms as legitimate to dig further, which means this disease can announce itself first not through pain, not through your stomach, not through your weight, but through a number on a blood sugar monitor, something almost nobody would think to trace back to the pancreas at all. And that's still not the strangest one. Sign 6, the one the researchers themselves describe as more of a lead than a conclusion, a new depression, anxiety, or disrupted sleep showing up before anything else on this list. Let's be careful here because this is the newest, least certain territory in the entire investigation. A narrative review published in 2026 found that somewhere between 10 and 20% of pancreatic cancer patients reported new depressive symptoms in the months leading up to diagnosis. Symptoms not explained by the weight loss or the diabetes we just covered. And in the same large health record study running through this entire investigation, mood and sleep symptoms were, on average, the earliest signal of all, beginning 8 to 16 months before diagnosis, months before the back pain, months before the fatigue, before any of it. Here's the proposed reason, though it remains a hypothesis, not a settled fact. Tumors can release inflammatory signaling molecules, proteins like interleukin-6 and TNF-alpha that travel through the bloodstream and appear to affect brain chemistry directly. not stress, not circumstance. A disease acting on the body from a distance through chemical signals rather than direct contact. Researchers call this a paraneoplastic effect. To be clear about what this is not, it is not a warning test. It is not proof of anything. The scientists behind this work call it hypothesis generating, a lead worth investigating, not a conclusion. And depression has an almost endless list of ordinary causes that have nothing to do with cancer. If this were the whole story, we'd be telling millions of people with ordinary depression to fear their pancreas. That would be irresponsible, and it isn't what the evidence says. But sit with this for a second. The earliest whisper of this disease in some patients may not come from the body at all. It may come from the mind, through a channel almost nobody would ever think to check. And none of the first 5 signs will make complete sense until you see what happens next. Because here's the twist buried underneath all 6 of these signals. The one piece of this puzzle that changes how you should read everything you just heard. Line up all 6 by how early they tend to appear, and the order is almost the reverse of what you'd expect. Mood and sleep disturbances come first, sometimes a year or more out. Back pain follows, then fatigue, then weight loss and digestive changes, clustering closer to diagnosis, typically around 4 months out. And jaundice, the single most specific sign of pancreatic cancer that exists, the one with a statistical association so strong it makes every other symptom on this list look almost irrelevant by comparison, arrives last, often at the exact moment of diagnosis, not before it. Which means the most obvious, undeniable proof of this disease is also the latest thing to show up, and that changes everything. By the time the body produces a symptom nobody could reasonably explain away, the disease has often already had the better part of a year to grow, quietly, underneath 6 warnings that all sounded like something else. This isn't a flaw in the human body. It isn't a failure of the people who miss it. It's simply how this particular cancer is built. The undeniable proof comes last, and everything before it speaks no ordinary life. And the stakes behind that timing are not small. In US data from 2015 through 2021, pancreatic cancer caught while still confined to the pancreas has a 5-year survival rate around 44%. Once it's spread widely, that number falls to roughly 3%. But only about 1 in 9 patients are ever diagnosed while it's still that contained. That gap between 44% and 3% is in large part a gap in timing, which is exactly why the quiet signals matter as much as the loud one, maybe more. Now, the honest part, because a mystery isn't worth telling if it isn't told straight. Every single sign on this list is, most of the time, something else entirely. Back pain is usually just a back problem. Appetite changes are usually reflux, gastritis, or plain IBS. Fatigue is far more often thyroid trouble, anemia, or a brutal stretch of life. New onset diabetes almost always is exactly what it looks like, ordinary type 2 diabetes. A low mood, most of the time, is exactly what it looks like too. Even jaundice is more often gallstones or hepatitis than cancer. That's not a disclaimer tacked on to the end of a scary video. That's the actual reason a doctor doesn't order a CT scan the moment someone mentions feeling tired. A single vague symptom on its own correctly points towards something far more common and far more treatable, almost every time. What shifts the picture is persistence without explanation, and clustering, several of these signs showing up together in someone already carrying more risk with nothing else obvious already accounting for them. Risk isn't evenly distributed. It climbs with age. Several major clinical guidelines treat these symptom combinations with more urgency after 60. Smoking is one of the few risk factors anyone can actually change. A family history of pancreatic cancer or an inherited genetic syndrome linked to it raises the baseline meaningfully. So does chronic pancreatitis, long-term inflammation, often from heavy alcohol use or gallstones. And new onset diabetes after 50, without the usual explanations, is specific enough that some researchers flag it entirely on its own. None of this is a case for scanning the general population. Major health authorities, including the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, explicitly recommend against it. The disease is too rare, and there still isn't a blood test sensitive enough to catch it early in someone without symptoms. What it does mean, in people already at higher risk, the same vague symptoms most people can reasonably ignore deserve a slightly lower threshold before being dismissed. And one more thing worth correcting directly, the idea that pancreatic cancer gives no warning at all. The data says otherwise. It has signs. They're just quiet and easy to blame on anything else. That's a very different problem than having no signs, and it's the entire reason this investigation exists. Here's what all of this actually comes down to once the studies and the odds ratios are set aside. Almost everyone has a reflex to explain their own body away. Tired? Must be the week. Back sore? Must be the chair. Less hungry lately? Must be stress. That reflex isn't foolish. It's usually correct. It's the only reason anyone gets through a normal week without living in quiet medical panic. But there's a difference between reasonable reassurance and reflexive dismissal. And that gap, narrow, easy to miss, is exactly where this entire investigation lives. This was never about making you afraid of of being tired. It's about noticing the moment your own explanation stops fitting the facts. When the fatigue doesn't lift, when the weight keeps dropping, when 3 or 4 small, individually forgettable things start showing up together and refuse to resolve on their own. The body doesn't always announce trouble the way we expect it to. Sometimes it says it quietly for the better part of a year in a language that sounds exactly like ordinary life. A little more tired, a little less hungry, a little heavier in the back, right up until the moment it stops whispering. Learning to hear that quieter version isn't paranoia. It's a kind of literacy. And like most literacy, it's far more useful learned early than learned in an emergency. So where does this leave you, practically? Not with a diagnosis, not with a checklist to run through in a panic. These signs matter more when they're persistent, weeks, not days. Unexplained by anything else already happening in your life and showing up in combination rather than alone. A single tired week means almost nothing. Months of fatigue, a backache that won't quit, and weight you can't account for, together mean something worth a conversation. That's the entire point of everything you just heard. Not to diagnose anything from a video. Nothing responsible ever could. But to make sure that if this exact pattern ever shows up in your life or in someone you love, it registers as worth saying out loud, instead of getting explained away one quiet symptom at a time, the way it almost always is. There's one piece of this story no research paper captures: what these signs actually feel like from the inside, before anyone has a name for them. That part only exists in the people who've lived it. So here's the actual question. Of the 6 signs in this investigation, the fatigue, the back pain, the appetite changes, the weight loss, the diabetes, the mood shift, which one do you think you'd be most likely to explain away in yourself? And if you've ever waved off a symptom that turned out to matter more than you expected, that's the story worth telling below. It might be the exact detail someone else needs to hear before they wave off their own.